My name is Jesper. The reason why I stand here today claiming to know anything about this is that I've spent the best part of the last 6.5 years working exclusively with different models for Agile and Lean product development. I've done that as a mentor and coach. I've done that as a Scrum Master, product owner, pretty much in any role in any type of organization you can think of. So at least I have some experience now, and let's see if that has brought anything good with it. Good. I come from a company called Trifork. I won't cover the entire slide here, but what I think is important is that Trifork is still mainly a software house, meaning that 80% of the employees at Trifork still spend their daily lives building actual software, writing actual code. So our interest in Agile and Lean product development comes from our need to do that ourselves to provide value for our own customers. And as you probably know, we also arranged the GOTO conference series here in Aarhus, our leading conference, but also in Copenhagen, Prague, and Amsterdam. We also do the GOTOcon conferences in collaboration with InfoQ, and the biggest ones are in London and San Francisco, but they are now launched all over the world. Good. So, reflecting on the past 6.5 years, this is what it turns out has happened a number of times. I think I know it all. I found out that damn, reality seems to be different than my mental model. I tried to adjust the model. I tried to apply the new model with some success. I think I know it all again. But sometimes it just turns out that damn, reality changed again. Or I face a new organization, a new situation where things just didn't work according to my mental model. So I've had a number of shifts during the last 6.5 years, and some of those shifts I will share with you today. My experience in software started back in 2001 or here in 2002, where I'd been studying for about a year and a half, and we got into diving into some of the books behind what it takes to do professional software development. How many of you have read the Somerville book? Okay. That has got to be one of the most incredibly boring books I have read in my entire life. That is just filled with things that make you say, damn. I remember they sold the computer science education by, you get to create the world. If this is what it takes to create the world, I'm not sure I want to be part of it. So that was the first learning opportunity. Does it really take this much pain and effort to do software? Do we really need to do all this? Do we need to fill out COCOMO models for estimation just to get software out the door and provide value for our user? I was thinking more in terms of customer collaboration, actually. Good. So in 2003, we had a course called Extreme Programming. And arguably the teacher had very, very little experience with doing this in practice, but he made us read this book, and that actually sounded pretty good. XP is cool, that was my first reaction. You get the on-site customer, you get to work together as a team, you get to pair program, all that was very, very nice, and it was much better fit for my mental model. What surprised me though was, what is with that religious attitude? It seemed that Ken Beck would actually send you to hell if you were not doing pair programming, TDD, user stories, refactoring, system metaphors, on-site customers, and so on. And it seemed like a very, very fragile house of cards, because his argument would be all these are very fragile independently, but if you use them all at the same time and do it very, very strict, you will be successful. And I'm sure that whenever a project wasn't successful using XP in these early days, he would be able to point to at least 2 or 3 factors where they weren't being strictly XP. So it seemed like it had some religious aspects. It seemed that it was too easy to afterwards evaluate that this was not a success just because you didn't follow the practice individually. In 2004, I got my first job. Student job, arguably, and my first reaction was, I can't believe they're paying me to write software. It was like being paid to play with Lego all day. It was, oops, sorry, I'll just go back. Oh, wrong button, sorry. It was SAP. How many of you have tried programming in the ABAP programming language? That's not a very fantastic language, is it? But you get to do some things really, really fast. And since this was just my first job, I was just impressed that people were actually paying me to do this. I don't know if any of you have had the similar experience, but to me it was really like playing with Lego all day. I didn't pay too much attention to what happened to my work afterwards. And this was a big, big, big organization. And they had a value stream looking something like this. This is something I studied after I finished my job there. For the work I was doing there, we probably had an average lead time of something like 33.5 months. This software, I built that. It didn't even get near production while I was still working there. Wait time during that period was probably around 31 months. So there was a long, long feedback loop there. And to this day, I haven't got proof that any of the things I built there came any close to being used with real users accessing the system using the actual features I built. I did contact, and it was confirmed that it actually made it to production 1.5 years after I left the company. But whether people actually used it, I have no idea. Then in 2006, I got my degree, and I started working at Trifork. Meaning, yes, I've worked for at Trifork for the past 6.5 years. They made me read the Scrum book, one of the first Scrum book by Ken Swaber and Mike Beadle. And they also made, I think that was on my very first day, I was put on a certified Scrum Master course led by Jeff Sutherland. And I thought, this makes a lot of sense. You've taken away some of the more religious stuff of the XP. You're still able to actually use XP practices in your teams if you find that it suits your context, but it's more of a management framework, and it's not so focused on the engineering practices, which arguably will shift from context to context. So, I worked at Trifork. We used Scrum. That went very well. I very quickly transitioned into the role as Scrum Master. And I started studying Scrum in a bit more detail, and among others I read the books by Mike Cohn on actually how to do the more value-driven part of building software using Scrum and applying some of the user story techniques and techniques for agile estimation and planning, and all was very good and fine. I even got to take a Scrum product owner course by Roman Pickler to get the more business focus on what it actually takes to build value to your customers. And in 2007, I also did my first class. How many of you here have had the benefit of a teaching experience, not being taught, but actually teaching yourself? Good. I hope that, like me, you will find that is something that indeed sharpens your mind and makes you study things in a bit more detail and be a bit more clear. Plus, you actually learn a lot from your students. I've tried to calculate. I've probably taught classes for between 1,200 and 1,700 people during the past 6.5 years. And they think they're there to learn, but they don't know that I'm there to learn as well. So whenever you teach somebody, they will ask questions, you will have discussion, and you get to put on a lot of details, and you get a lot, and you get to apply a lot of context. Where had you just experienced that 1 or 2 projects, you just wouldn't have. So if the rest of you haven't had this experience, ever get the chance to teach, grab it. It might seem hard at first, it might require some preparations, but it's definitely worthwhile. For the individual team I worked on, we got to the point where we would be releasing software to production every 3 weeks. At this point in time, this was great. Remember, this was back in time. It's not now where people are releasing 50 times a day to production using lean startup methods, which Joshua will share with us later. But still, at this point in time, releasing software every 3 weeks to a production environment and doing it on a regular basis and with stable quality software, that was good. We thought we were fantastic at this point. Our value stream compared to the example earlier had changed a lot. So we would have a lead time of probably between 5 and 14 weeks, wait time of 3 to 10. And this is just things waiting on the actual backlog to get implemented after the decision has been made. And the value adding time is much, much smaller. So in general, we're getting feedback loops an order of magnitude faster than in my previous job, which should also prove very, very beneficial in terms of both quality and stuff like that. In 2008, I was off to save the world. I've had experience from a couple of in-house projects, and I now thought I had the knowledge and the skills to go out and help others do things better in their own situation. I also got to fill out the form, pay the $100 and become a certified Scrum professional. And that is actually, at this point in time, that was all you had to do. Use a good 7 hours, fill in the form, get it out the door, pay your bill, and then you're good to go. But still, it's something at this point in time, it was something the market demanded, and it's something that would actually put value on. As Jutta explained a bit earlier, we all know now that there's a limit as to how much you can learn on a CSM course in 2 days, and there's definitely also a limit as to how much evaluation you can do by filling out a simple form. And I had very, very good success doing this. And I thought, man, I'm good at this. Not only am I affecting 1 or 2 teams that I'm currently working on in my daily life, I am also out there helping real companies do things better. So it was a very, very gratifying experience. And I would typically be saying something like this. You know what? What you have to do is be a bit better at sprint planning. I can give you some tools and tricks to make it go a bit smoother and a bit faster, and I can make sure that you're all a bit happier about going into a sprint planning session. Afterwards, I'll talk a bit with you about the backlog, Mr. Product Owner, and I'm sure that we can work out a better way of you delivering value and making sure that you start the right stuff and you keep the lower priorities further down your list. Also, I would like you to use these simple techniques for retrospectives. And in general, people were very, very happy with this advice. It was simple. I pretty much had to go out there. I had my small checklist in my head. I knew the Scrum practices, the Scrum ceremonies. I had the experience to know where things often went wrong. This was not a very, very complicated world. So, again, I thought, man, I'm good. And don't worry, I won't go on like this for much longer. Because now suddenly an ugly thing starts to happen. First of all, I had some friends working with Lean in other contexts in software. And they said, you know, even though you're doing product development, which is not manufacturing, there's a lot of good ideas in this, and you need to pay attention to this because it's got a lot to do with the fast feedback loops. It's got a lot to do with trying to optimize for effectiveness, not efficiency, and all that. So I started reading some of the older basic lean manufacturing stuff, and I also went through the Poppendick book about how to use this in the IT space. And while we got to discuss this, they kept telling me, it seems like you focus an awful lot on batch optimization in Scrum. And I'm like, no. You know what? You've got it all wrong. You know, those waterfall guys, they're the ones being suboptimal. They're the ones focusing on batch optimization. In Scrum, you know what? We're focusing on flow. And I had the weirdest dream. And this is an actual dream. Suddenly I was there arguing with Homer Simpson himself about whether Scrum was batch optimization or not. And you know what? I couldn't convince him. I couldn't convince Homer that Scrum in some sense did not rely on batch optimization. Trying to plan a batch of work, getting it through your system as fast as possible, and then start the next chunk. It just, like, Homer wouldn't accept my argument that was just the minimum size batch we could work on. And also, he wouldn't accept that some of the challenges I started to face didn't have anything to do with this particular fact. Because the surface at this point was already starting to crack. You would see me saying something like this, but I told you, we haven't got the right product owner. We haven't got a real Scrum cross-functional team. We're not even following basic Agile practices. You are all wrong. Like, what you're doing is simply wrong. And if you just change this, I know you can be in a better place, and nothing happened. Like, just because I was hammering them, and just because I was saying, I told you so a lot of times, Things didn't magically change from one aspect to the other. I would have PO teams saying something like, we're behind, how can we keep the development team busy? How can we make sure that they continuously have got something to do? Because that's what's important, right? It's not to deliver functionality. It's not to deliver value. It's just to keep the development team busy. And they would start things just to start things. They would just look at their backlog and say, okay, what can we start right now? Instead of what should we start? And I told them that was wrong, but still, they didn't follow my advice. And teams would be focusing on stuff like, let's do the hack. They expect 220 story points from us. Let's get going. Hurry up. Our goal is to reach 220 story points. And I would tell them, your goal is not to reach 220 story points. It is to deliver value. And again, they would not listen to me. Knowledge sharing, pair programming, quality, not if it affects our sprint commitment. And at this point in time, I was working with some of the best developers in the country with years of Agile experience, and still this is how they would behave. Why were they doing this? I would tell them, please do not do this, and still they would do this. Batch optimization. At least that was what I thought at this point. As you'll see, my mental model is going to change a few times. And we would have product owners saying to them, yeah, right, like I've got time to involve end users. They would have to do with me as a feedback loop, because you know what, if I'm going to involve end users, I know exactly what's going to happen. They're going to give me feedback. And you know what happens when they give me feedback? I get even further behind. Incremental, you're saying? That must be the same. That's just another word for Agile development. It just turns out it isn't. And there was the issue of organizational change. Some of the organizations I met had been through numerous change initiatives, and their idea was that if they could just prove this wrong in 6 months, they would be back to business as usual. And as some of you will probably realize, if you set out to prove that something is wrong in 6 months, you have an almost 100% guaranteed success. Because if you do not take part in the change initiatives, there's very, very little chance of it ever becoming a success. And we would have management stating something like, yes, I know we're behind schedule. That is why I've just hired 3 new developers, and I want everybody to work overtime. And they would be hugely surprised, even though I had told them so, that when they added 200 extra hours, they would get 400 hours further behind. But again, why didn't they listen? Sprint deadlines is approaching. Let's just get something out the door. The goal of us doing sprints is just to get something out the door. Again, I would tell them, no, the goal of the sprint is to deliver value to your customers, is to test our business hypothesis. But still, they would just be hunting down those story points. And I would be running around saying, no, come on, you're all wrong. Why are you doing this to me? You're ruining my success factor. It's unfair. And it felt much like this. Of course, I had some interim successes. If you work with enough teams, you're going to have some successes. It's almost hard not to. But for the most cases in this period of my life, it wasn't a great success. I didn't change. I caused a lot of frustration. No doubt. And my level of I told you so was all the way up there. And whenever things failed, I could just tell them, yeah, but I know, you know what? I told you you would fail. Basically, it felt like my religion was crashing down on me. And I don't know how many of you have had that experience of something that was supposed to be a perfect mental model just didn't fit reality anymore, and that you faced the fact that you had to drastically change. How many of you? Oh, almost half. So I'm not alone in this. And then, fortunately, there's guys named David Anderson and Henrik Nieberg, and they would say something like, you know what, Jesper? It's not you alone. There are different ways out there. If you just focus on pulling to capacity, Forget about sprint plannings. That's batch optimization. You just have to manage flow. Look at the flow of work. Don't look at the individual principles and practices. Look at the actual value. You know what? Agile is adaptable. Once you focus on practices, it becomes cargo cult. What you should instead focus on is what can you improve in your current situation. Try to just visualize your flow. Try to have sustainable pace. Don't just copy the mechanics. Your checklist of how to do Scrum, throw it out the window. Or at least use it in the specific context where it's applicable and not just everywhere as a general tool. There are no silver bullets. And I was like, yeah, this is exactly what I need. This will solve all my problems. Guys, this is how it's going to work from now on. You're no longer an individual development team. What we have here is a system, and we have to optimize the whole. And if that means moving somebody from the development team to the business processes, or vice versa, that is just how we'll do it. We'll look at the flow of work. We'll pull to capacity. We'll drop the sprint planning sessions where you all look very, very bored just going into the meeting. Now we'll focus on just-in-time analysis and pulling work in as capacity becomes available. Damn, I'm good. Again, finally, I'm having success. We're improving. Things are changing. People are actually starting to follow my advice again. I'm a good coach. And people were saying thank you. Thank you, Jesper. This is much better than Scrum. Fortunately, a couple of the teams I had the pleasure to work with had been doing Scrum for a while, and they were looking for new inspiration as I was. So we were in this together. And they were saying, yes, this is actually going to improve the way we work. This is going to be more lean. We're going to focus on limiting our work in progress and making sure that there's flow through our value chain, and that we get feedback loops as soon as possible. And we'll be moving feedback loops even further up the value stream to make sure that things were not just evaluated at the end of a sprint, but were evaluated continuously doing the work. And I was like, yeah, I'll show you, all you Scrum fanatics out there. There's a lot better ways of doing this. Scrum is like so 2006. And now we have another way of looking at things. We're much more lean now. We're adaptable. We're going to be focusing on flow, and that's much better. And that's not an actual picture of me, but when I was around 16 or 17 years old, that was my haircut. I couldn't find a picture. I guess my mom just didn't like the haircut enough to actually take pictures of me, but that was much how I looked like. And this was much how I felt right now, rebelling against the society of Scrum. They're batch optimization. They're batch optimizing. They're focusing on the mechanics and not the principles behind. They're not even understanding what Agile and Lean development is all about. They're just following a simple checklist. And my presentations would have titles like, Scrum is not Agile. I actually did a presentation named Scrum. Have you got any idea how big a crowd that turns out when you call things like that? It's incredible. I actually considered naming this presentation a totally different name just to draw more people here. Turns out it wasn't. But if you write something like Scrum is not Agile, a lot of people is going to turn up. Of course, Introduction to Kanban. I'll have a presentation named Kanban, Crossing the Line, Pushing the Limit, or Rediscovering the Agile Vision, because that's really what I felt like, rediscovering what Agile is truly about. Oops. Hey, come on. In 2010, I read these two books. How many of you have read these books? Or just one of them? Okay, not that many. Maybe I should have done an Introduction to Kanban instead, or Introduction to Lean. For those of you who haven't read especially this one, do yourself a favor and read it. As I'll be stating in a few slides, it is just the Agile Bible. Don Ryerson didn't know that, but it is. And David wrote a book called simply just Kanban. And Kanban, the book Kanban at this point was an expression of a lot of the thinking David Anderson had been doing around the Kanban concept. So we all had now also not just only the Kanban word, but also a shared view of what Kanban truly is. And reading David's book, my initial reaction was something like, excellent, there's a few things that falls into place. This is very, very valuable. But why is he talking about Kanban as an evolutionary change method? And what is up with operations reviews? He will of course also state the 5 principles, which also help me align my thinking about Kanban in a bit better way. I'm not going to go through the Kanban principles, as this is not an introduction to Kanban. But all in all, this seems to fit my mental model, except there's a few outliers, which I would just pretty much ignore at this point. So I would state something, I had to be faithful to what had been done in the knowledge community around Kanban, so I couldn't state exactly, okay, so I would just want you to work like this instead of how you worked previously. So I had gotten the change management aspect of Kanban, so I would initially say something like, okay, so start with what you do now. That's one of the core values in Kanban. Do not change anything initially. But if I could just get you to change these 5 things initially, I would very, very much appreciate it, because I know that'll get you to a better place. Turns out that was terrible advice, but anyway, nobody caught on to it. So for a while, that still went pretty good. And I would start giving presentations like, again, Scrum is not religion, and adapted version of the previous one. Super optimized Agile using Kanban and Lean. Kanban version 2, results cannot be ignored. I'd finally got some good results doing this, so the world was all good and fine. And I would try to actually apply this to Scrum teams. And what changed here during 2009 is that instead of starting with actually visualizing the typical Kanban board, where you would simply just pull one thing in as you were able to take one thing out of the system, we would initially change nothing about the Scrum process. So now we're starting with the real evolutionary change method. So a Kanban board would look something like this, where things were, you see, there's a typical Scrum process in here. You would make things ready for sprint planning. You would plan your sprint, and as you see the WIP limits up there, they are applied to the sprint as a whole. So we pull items in for a sprint as a whole, and then we would continue to improve this system over time. And if that sometimes meant dropping the sprint, we would do that. And in other typical situations, we would actually keep the sprint, and would use some of the other aspects of Kanban, the optimizing the whole, the looking at the entire system. It turns out that doing this without changing the Scrum process is a fantastic way of optimizing your distributed teams, because this way you get the whole value chain in there, and you get people from Malaysia actually paying attention to what happens in the business area, and you get them actually suddenly having discussions with the business way earlier than they would have had previously, because it's not at the sprint planning meeting they see things the first time. You get to apply policies like, before you can pull things into sprint planning, it has to be evaluated, but not just people from Denmark, but people from India, Malaysia, or whoever you're working with. And that just makes a huge difference when they start calling the product owner or the end users directly, instead of having the team in Denmark function as a kind of a hub where every kind of communication has to go through. So this was pretty good. And I had to acknowledge at this point that Scrum and Kanban are working quite well together, and that maybe Kanban is truly an evolutionary change method, that there are no practices in there. There are nothing telling you what to do. There are only principles for looking at your system, evaluating the system, and seeing where can you do things differently, where can you optimize flow, where can you improve collaboratively. Good. And then I read Don Reinertsen's book, and this was my reaction. Have I found the Agile Bible? Is this actually what it's all been about from the very beginning, and I just hadn't realized it? It's very, very dense, that book, mind you. It is 300 pages, and I spoke to Don about this. Why did you make it 300 pages? Oh yeah, my editor said that if I made it 600 pages, nobody would buy it. But it's incredibly dense, Don. Yeah, I kind of took 12 years of work and packed it into 300 pages. So it's incredibly dense, and it's not even targeted in the Agile space. So Don didn't know at this point that he was writing it for us. but that's what he's done. So you have to read this book. And somebody just forgot to tell him that he is in fact the Agile Jesus. He is here explaining to us the foundations of Agile and why all this works under the surface, beyond just blindly doing test-driven development or having sprint planning meetings. Why are we doing this? What does it mean to be lean? What does it mean to optimize for flow and effectiveness over efficiency? Why are we trying to eliminate variability in software when variability is our only asset, and that we cannot eliminate variability without also eliminating value? So stuff like that is something that will be mind-blowing to most of the people that read his books. And it's much more based on actual facts and economics frameworks that you would see in other lean product development books. So I'm a huge fan of Don, no doubt about it. In 2011, I also started getting involved in the Kanban community. I went to the Kanban leadership retreat in Iceland, and I even got to use the stamp approved Kanban trainer by David J. Anderson. Wasn't that nice? Starting to look a bit like Scrum, isn't it? No. So for me, that was a good thing. I'm not a big social media person, it turns out. I've tried Twitter, as you see, I've got my Twitter tag down there, but as you'll also notice, I've got more followers than I've got tweets, I think. So that's a sign that I'm not the blogger and Twitter I hope to be. It might change in the future, it could be, I don't think it's very likely to happen. So for me, meeting up with people face to face is the way I expand my horizon. And I had a busy summer. How many of you have read my book? Not a whole lot. You should do that. It's downloadable for free at InfoQ. So just go to that site, type Priming Kanban, and you get to download it for free. I think 12,000 have done that, so that was surprisingly a lot of people that found it useful. So I wrote the Priming Kanban book. I thought that would be my contribution to the grander Agile, the grander Kanban community, since it turns out that blogging and tweeting was not my main area of expertise. And then finally it happened. There's not a single or two or a few teams that asked me. There was a lot of teams suddenly wanting me to help them implement Kanban, and my initial reaction was, yes sir. We are so going to do this. And these are just some of the examples of the many, many Kanban systems I have helped people design. And as you will see, it is very, very different. And as you'll see, somebody tended to misunderstand the concept a few times. So you see, this is actually the queue. It wasn't enough space on the board, so they just argued that it was better to just have a small rope underneath the board where they could hold their expanding number of items they didn't work on. We had to have a talk about that when we did the evaluation of the. But what is also surprising when you do this is that because there is no judgment, because there is no, this is how you should do things now and forever, because it's not a silver bullet attitude. It turns out that whatever systems people come up with is incredibly different. Like, there are so many examples, and you learn so much from helping teams do this, and next time you get to present these ideas as if they were your own. So you get a lot cleverer because you learn from all the very, very clever people out there. So this was very, very good. In 2012, something very weird started to happen. Suddenly, there were no people contacting me for Kanban coaching assignments. I had no idea why, but that's how it went. But on the other hand, it was very much focused on Scrum again. And I guess you can expect me to be a bit confused. I'd been able to put my Kanban hat on and my Scrum hat on when I did actual training. So doing a 2-day Scrum course, I could keep my Scrum hat on for 2 days, and I could faithfully present what Scrum was about, the more revolutionary approach to change management. But actually going out there, coaching and doing real Scrum implementation, initially I found it pretty hard because I'd been so used to the Kanban mindset, the evolutionary change way of of approaching things. And suddenly I had to deal with organization-wide Scrum transitions. We're not getting the full benefit of Scrum. Could you help restart our Scrum initiative? And to be honest, the first ones who contacted me would get an answer, yeah, I think you're better off with Kanban. Because that's really my hammer right now. And I pretty much want to hammer on everything that's nearby, including all people wanting to do Scrum. And instead of focusing on Scrum, you should really just use the principles. But it turns out that when people are approaching you and they want to buy something from you, they expect you to actually provide that service and not to try to sell them something very, very, very different. And then I got a bit schizophrenic. And sometimes I would be standing there and I wasn't really sure if I was speaking to them about Scrum, Kanban, Lean, organizational change, or whether we were just participating in a sprint planning session. So if it was confusing for them, there's nothing compared to how confused I was for a short period of time. And then something very, very weird happened. It turned out they were quite successful. So we applied Scrum, and we did it in a revolutionary way. We focused a lot on the mechanics. We introduced sprint planning meetings. We changed roles. We changed processes. We restarted teams, and they were quite successful. They didn't at all fall into the trap of, no, this is an organizational change initiative. I'm going to resist it from now on and until it pushes back, and we're back to doing things as we always did. So it was working quite well. So again, my mental model, I had now thought, okay, so what we have been doing with Agile is basically just wrong. Instead, we need to do evolutionary change initiatives because an organization is much like a software project. You cannot predict the reactions of people. You cannot plan your way to success. We need to do Agile implementations in a more Agile way. But suddenly, I was having a lot of success doing the exact opposite. So the mental model shifted again. And the question is also, how much evolutionary change can you do in a situation where you're starting things from scratch? Somebody will argue very, very little. And if you read some of the Kanban books and Kanban blogs, you will also learn that Kanban is supposed to be applied on top of an existing process. So when there is no existing process, you're probably better off doing things where you get to learn the mechanics. And also it turns out that, again, context is very, very much key. So if you've got a team of young or just very change-ready people, you might be able to get off by doing revolutionary change. And you might get to success a lot faster than had you applied an evolutionary change method like Kanban. How many of you know the Dreyfus model of skill acquisition? Can anybody remember what it says as one of the very, very first steps? Where do you start from when acquiring any new skill? Yeah, and what characterizes a beginner? Yeah, they need rules. They need basic rules and practices. And once they become an advanced beginner, they will start to challenge those practices. And they will learn that putting your hand into the fire is a bad thing. But if there is nothing to start with, that might actually be the very, very best way of approaching an agile transition. And that just tells us again that it's got much more to do with how you approach change than the model behind it. And whether to do it in a more revolutionary way or whether to do it evolutionary depends a lot on the organization and the people you're working with. And there is no just one size fits all, and that counts for agile change initiatives as well. So this is how I currently perceive Scrum and Kanban, and we could draw XP on there as well. It's not that there is no initialization phase when you start a Kanban change initiative. There is, and I've experienced teams where just visualizing your work proved impossible because they were doing pretty much everything except following whatever guidelines had been stuck out by leadership. So if you've got a team of people that are working against all the policies in the organization, don't count on them to think, okay, the best idea we could ever do is just put them on a wall for everybody to see. And it's not that they're bad people. They're doing this because they think that's the best thing to do for the organization. But it takes change. But we get there a lot faster. So if this represents base camp, so you have to get up here before you really start to inspect and adapt. Then what I've found is that the Scrum base camp is a lot higher up the mountain. And as some of you have probably experienced, some teams and organizations, they never get there. I've been out on consulting gigs where they've been doing Scrum for 3 or 4 years, and they're still not at base camp, and all they strive for is getting up to that base camp. So they're not even paying attention to their context. They're still trying to fit their own organization into the Scrum boxes. And if you've been trying to do that for 3 or 4 years and failed, maybe you should start to look at doing other things. Because chances are, if you never get to base camp, you're just going to be stuck doing Scrum endlessly. And it's not going to provide you a whole lot of value. Maybe you should start to pay attention to understanding the principles behind Scrum instead. But for some, you will get there very, very quickly. And you'll be much higher up the mountain when you start to inspect and adapt. And for some, that's a really, really valuable thing to do. And I've also experienced situations where we've had people that were way too change ready to start with an evolutionary change initiative. So for them to have to climb to base camp there, when they know they could get up there at least as fast, that's just not the way they want to do things. I had some problems coming up with the right way of expressing how I currently feel about these different relationships and my current mental model. But fortunately, there are people out there that are a lot more clever than I am. And I read on Liz Keog's blog the following statement. Kanban works in a larger set of contexts than Scrum does, even though for a subset Scrum might achieve results faster. They're still more similar than they are different. And I still like XP too. And I think that's a very, very beautiful statement because it captures pretty much the essence. Scrum and Kanban are not that different. They're both adaptable frameworks for process optimization. But for some, you reach your goal of process optimization a lot faster by choosing either one way or the other. But the ground principles are still very, very much the same. And we could probably all benefit from looking at the XP practices as well. How many of you are doing refactoring on a continuous basis? A lot of you. How many of you are working with test-driven development? Not as much as you would expect. How many have an on-site customer? Okay, more than I would expect. So a lot of teams found it beneficial to look in the XP toolbox. My problem with XP is still that as a framework, I'm not sure it works that well. It's simply too hard to implement. Right now, I'm exploring new grounds. So these are the latest books I've read. And you'll see a presentation on the Lean Startup movement up there, so I'll save that for later. Running Lean is very closely related to that. This book by Egil Ries presents the overall principles, and the other by Ash Murray gets into some of the more implementation details of actually how to do this stuff in practice. Toyota Kata is a book about how Toyota approaches continuous improvement. And the funny thing about reading that book is that will state that retrospectives are very, very ineffective. Retrospectives is a hopeless, ineffective way of approaching continuous improvement. So they present some radically different ways of doing it and argues that what people have been trying to copy is the Kaizen event that they've seen people do at Toyota. But what they haven't been able to copy is the process behind that Kaizen event, and that the Kaizen event is just the mechanic and not the actual principle. And what we're doing right now with retrospectives would be the argument from these guys, I'm not sure I follow them all the way, is that having a retrospective, you're pretty much just asking people to look at a situation and fire with whatever problems or solution they think would be necessary to make the situation better. Not with the necessary metrics put in place to actually evaluate whether it's true, not with the attitude where you get this as a part of your actual culture, but more of a religious mindset where you aren't really able to prove that you're getting anywhere near in the right direction. So if you get the chance, try to read that. It's a pretty quick read as well, and it provides some very, very interesting studies into how Toyota approaches continuous improvement. And of course, Jess Humble will also talk a bit about continuous delivery, which I also find very interesting no matter what method you're using, because having releasable software all the time provides a lot of value in terms of keeping feedback loop type quality high and being able to reduce transaction cost and deliver fast in any type of situation. In 2012, I've also become a part of the LKU accredited Kanban training program. It is not a certification, as I think Jutta mistakenly introduced it as a bit earlier. This is in fact only an accredited program, meaning that the program itself and the trainer is accredited quality, but you do not get a role or a title from participating. You do get a certificate of completion, but the reason why is that LKU have stated that we will only certify things that have an actual evaluation of acquired skills, and we cannot do that in a 2-day course. Okay. So my conclusion from the last 6.5 years and continuous change of mental models is that Scrum is an excellent way of introducing agile principles, but be careful in thinking that it's a silver bullet that applies to all situations. It might be sold to you as a management framework, but there are a lot of practices and mechanics in there as well. So be careful with that, and be careful getting stuck and disregarding organizational resistance. I've had the experience coming into an organization where the CEO told me, whatever you do, do not mention Agile and Scrum, because they'll chase you out of there in a minute. Because they've had, and that had nothing to do with Scrum, but that had to do with how Scrum had been previously tried to be implemented. So they had not at all owned the Scrum implementation process. For them, there had just been a series of mechanics that didn't fit their situation, and they were very, very much against anyone trying to do that again. To me, right now, Kanban is about global optimization and how to deal elegantly with introducing Agile and Lean concept in most contexts. Whether you want to use Scrum or flexible scheduling, pulling to capacity, pulling one item in as you finish another, is a detail that in most situations can be deferred to later. Use whatever you're doing right now. That is not whether you pull an item at the time or you have sprint planning meetings, is arguably in most situations not the things that's going to make a whole lot of difference in terms of you becoming a success. XP practices like test-driven development, refactoring, user stories, on-site customers are all very useful, and they should be part of your toolbox in your organization. It doesn't mean that they'll fit all types of teams, all types of people. And it also means that you have to be very, very patient in implementing this. In one organization, it took more than 5 months to have people doing continuous pair programming on a daily basis. And that was through a lot of storytelling, a lot of coaching, and it doesn't happen overnight. You have to get very, very used to that way of working. If you start people out by having them pair program 7 hours a day, I can guarantee you that they won't be of any value after 1 o'clock anyway, because it's so stressful in the beginning. So do it in the Agile way. And Lean product development, to me, represents some powerful principles that help us understand the underlying economics of Agile delivery, but it needs a catalyst to be implemented. How many of you have read the Poppendick books? Have any of you found them to be directly applicable to your context or situation? Chris, you're shaking your head. Why not?
Too abstract. I mean, it's kind of the principles, yes, but then there's a lot of that goes from there to actually.
Yeah, I think one place she states that test-driven development is very, very good if you want to deliver quality software, and it's very close to the lean concept of poka-yoke, mistake proofing. And you're like, yeah, okay, that's good to know. So it's a lean technique. It maps into the lean framework. Okay. It doesn't really provide you with a framework of catalyzing the introduction of these ideas. So, in general, thank you. Download this book, and then I've actually got a new book called Real Life Scrum coming up shortly. The text is written, it's been through proofreading, it's about to go into design, and then I need a few people to finish their forwards for me, but it should also be available through the InfoQ site or some other site pretty soon. So search for Real Life Scrum and my name in a month or two, and it should be available. Since we are allowed to go 10 minutes over, we've got 10 minutes for questioning, so please just ask away, because I have to keep you here for another 10 minutes. Yes?
It seemed like
the question was, what does it actually take to get to the Scrum base camp? What kind of mechanics do you have to, or principles do you have to apply before you're at base camp and can start to inspect and adapt? And my answer would be that, first of all, it depends a lot on the individual organization. Some people will state that when you have a fixed sprint velocity, when you're able to do sprint planning in a day or less, when you have a product owner, a scrum master, and a self-organizing team that are able to fully decide how they will implement solutions, then you're at the Scrum base camp. Some will also apply the fact that you have to have visual sprint burndowns, that you have to have an agile release plan, so there can be a lot of detail according to the individual context. I can't remember what Salesforce provided what I think is the best definition of the Scrum base camp, but you'll have to look that up. There's a number of articles written on. They did a very, very revolutionary change into Scrum, and they actually defined a very, very nice set of principles you had to apply before you could start to inspect and adapt. I can't remember them off my head, but it's a pretty tight and not too detailed and long definition of how to. But okay, other questions? I have to keep you here for another 5 minutes. The question is, it seems that most of the occasions where Scrum failed, or you experience Scrum failing, is because there was an underlying model of fixed scope, fixed price, and fixed deadline underneath it, and that was actually what put the pressure so much on the teams that they couldn't follow Scrum or they couldn't be agile. And my answer would be that in a few of the situations that was definitely the context, but definitely not all of them. I saw it as much as the team's own pressure by themselves to fulfill their sprint commitment, to get something out the door, to meet the expectations of the surrounding organization, even though the surrounding organization was pretty flexible, and that had they just provided them data that would have shown them that okay, we have a different velocity now, or we need to work on this before we can refactor this part of the system to make it sustainable in the long run, they would definitely have the permission to do that. But still, they would just chasing story points, and they were becoming story points machines, even though there was no pressure from the outside organization to turn them into that. So definitely in some of the situations, but by far not all of them. The difference in applying Scrum or Kanban in different cultures. I would say it has a lot more to do with the people than the culture in terms of being a specific part of the world. I read an article once stating that there's a better chance of you having something in common with an Indian computer scientist than your HR person within your same company. That across the world, IT people seem to share a culture that is much more similar than the person sitting next to you in the canteen at your workplace. And I think that's very true. I think it's more to do with the actual people you've got there. One of the funniest experiences I had was 3 guys, and they were above 55 years old, all of them. And I came into them, and we're going to implement a Kanban system or a change model. And you just expect that there to be resistance. And they were like, this is fantastic. How quickly can we do all of this? And they had some repetitive work going on. I would say, oh, you have to keep that in Outlook or some old scheduling system because that really doesn't function well on a Kanban system board. And they were like, nope, that's not what we're going to do. We like this board concept. We want it all on the board. So they designed their own scheduling system as part of their Kanban board and put an amazing a lot of energy into that. And when I met them again, they were still just like the most positive guys I've ever met. So sometimes you can be surprised. But I've also definitely met the situation where I came in and it took a whole 2-day of training and coaching just to convince people that this was truly a change initiative they owned themselves, where they had gone through so many changes that just the word change and just the word change model and that they would be affected by any kind of change would attach to so much pain and suffering that they just didn't want to do it. I think the good story about that is that I did some statistical analysis on the very difficult situations I went into, and even in the most difficult of contexts, we managed to, applying Kanban, to have a positive outcome of in 80% of the cases, where I'm guessing that with a lot of other more managed change initiatives, it would have been as low as 10 or 20%.